So, we discussed the cyclics of solving particular tasks, which should be supported by the state in order for everyone to live well in the continuity of generations. And, in order for the cyclics to be realized, it is necessary to talk about the socio-economic formation, not just in general, but, namely, as an object of governance. That is, we have to talk about the internal structure of the socio-economic formation and about the interconnections that exist between its elements. If someone does not like the term socio-economic formation, which was introduced in Marxism, then there is another term, social economic system. But the essence of this matter does not change, because it should anyway be a question of society and its economy. Modern civilized society can be characterized as a set of social institutions which abide in interaction one with the other. The term social institution can be determined as a certain intrasocial formation that carries out certain social functions, and no other social institution can perform these functions either at all or as is due in relation to the level of development of civilization, the culture of society that has been achieved. If we talk about economics, then economics does not fit into such a definition of a social institution, since economics is not only people, but also all kinds of equipment, technologies, organizational and governorial procedures. Therefore, the socio-economic formation is a combination of a certain number of social institutions and the organizational technological complex of the national economy. In our understanding, such a division is appropriate. For what reason? For the reason that the same technologies, the same organizations, for the functioning of the economy, can be attributes of societies that are very different in how their social institutions have taken shape and how they are interconnected with each other and with the organizational technological complex of the economy itself. Example: all military affairs in civilizations. Because the organization of the army and navy, the organization of the military-industrial complex, has much in common if we turn to the history of the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition and in the Third Reich. Therefore, we can say that the organizational technological complex is, to a certain extent, independent of the social institutions that make up social life. Although a modern civilized society, without an organizational complex of the economy, is life inconsistent by strength of the fact that the technosphere is a necessity, and protection from the natural environment through the technosphere is a very significant factor, the significance of which we are usually convinced only when some natural disasters occur, or as a result of times of troubles and wars, when everything ceases to function in an acceptable for us mode. If we talk about the social institutions of a modern civilized society, then we can draw the following table. horizontally, sources of goods, and vertically, receivers of goods. These social institutions are family, statehood, science, system of education. That is, we have a table, 4 by 4. If you think about it, then it's not difficult to fill it in with the degree of detailedness required for governance. If you go through its elements, what does the family give to the family? Reproduction of the family line, direct care of each other by family members. What does statehood give to the family? We live in such conditions when the quality of life of each and every one is conditioned by the character of state governance. That is, the conception that is operating in state governance and the quality of governance in accordance with the chosen conception. Accordingly, within these two factors, statehood gives the family social protection and a certain quality of life for the family and the individual. What does science give? Science forms the outlook of the younger generations and adults over and above the generally obligatory educational minimum accepted in this era, in this particular society. The system of education gives the family a starting level of education and professionalism of new generations entering into life, which is the basis for their integration into the life of society, into adulthood. Then, the next line is statehood as a receiver of goods. What does the family give to statehood? Human resources, nraviousness, ethics, foundations of the cultural unity of society. All these things, one way or the other, are laid in the family and are formed by it. What does statehood give to statehood? Organization of the system of governance and reproduction of the subculture of governance on a professional basis in the continuity of generations. What does science give to statehood? Scientific methodological provision of current state governance and development of a political course for the future. What does the system of education give to statehood? Fundamentals of cultural political unity of society and cadres of professionals governors, as well as cadres for other spheres of activity. Science, as a receiver of goods, what does it receive? From the family, it receives human resources, nraviousness, ethics, as well as the foundations of the cultural unity of society, without which scientific activity, as a collective activity, in modern conditions is either unrealizable in principle or problematic. Statehood gives to science the organization of a system, support for fundamental science, which, in principle, is not capable of internal financing on a commercial basis, since it does not produce the final product. But it turns out, if correlated with the technological chain at the first stages of what is called technological conversion, although it usually does not convert raw materials drawn from nature, but conversions of some information, it turns out that the state, in a number of cases, ensures the setting of research tasks in the interests of implementing the politics of the state. Science provides science with the reproduction of the subculture of scientific research and the solution of applied tasks. And the system of education provides science with cadres of professionals, researchers, and developers. Further, the system of education acts as a receiver of goods given to it by other social institutions. From the family, human resources, nraviousness, ethics, the foundations of the cultural unity of society, without which the system of education cannot function. From the state, the organization of the system of education and the formulation of educational tasks. Science provides the system of education with a methodology of cognition and creativity in one form or another, a world understanding, that is, thematics and content of standards of education, cadres of professionals, teachers. And the system of education provides itself with cadres of professionals, teachers, and partly scientific methodological support for its activities. In order for society to develop stably in the continuity of generations, each of these social institutions must guaranteedly solve their tasks. And, at the same time, they must interact with each other according to the capabilities and needs of each of them. If, in the system of social relations, there is a violation of the function of any of the social institutions, or there is a violation of the organically necessary interconnections of the social institutions with each other, then society is doomed to experience problems. And the development of these problems can lead society to a catastrophe that can become irreversible. And the reality is such that for each cell of this table you can write a separate book, or at least a chapter for a sociology textbook. However, the reality is such that in our sociology textbooks, neither this table nor its content is practically presented in any form. And this is one of the problems of scientific methodological support of social development and state governance as one of the factors. Therefore, you will have to go into consideration of everything that happens in the system of the social institutions on your own, going from life, going from those possibilities that are open, or which, for various reasons, turn out to be closed. There is a well-known phrase, which came from Marxism, that the family is the unit of society. On the one hand, yes, it points to the role of the family. On the other hand, this is one of the formulations that blocks the correct understanding of what is happening in society. Because the family is not a unit of society, the family is not static. The family is the grain from which the future society grows. Because, if you look at this table, then all the social institutions, statehood, science, system of education, and all others that can be distinguished in society, but which we considered it possible to neglect, since they can be considered as branches of the named. They all, at different times, one way or the other, branched off from the family. That is, the family is really a grain from which the future society, with all its social institutions that are necessary for the life of society at this stage of civilizational development, will grow. And what about the functioning of the institution of the family throughout history? The first thing that catches the eye is that slave owners denied slaves the right to a family. Why? Slave owners cared about the biological and cultural superiority over the mass of slaves. This was achieved by destroying the institution of the family in the slave herd. Why? Because the family does not imply promiscuous sexual intercourse. In a slave herd, promiscuous sex is the norm. The genetic mechanism of the species Homo sapiens is not only chromosomes, it is also a biofield system in which information is also transmitted from ancestors to descendants. And if sexual intercourse is promiscuous, then, although the chromosomal genetic material leaves the organism of the woman within around 3 to 4 months, then, in the aspect of biofield heredity, in promiscuous sexual intercourse, it may turn out that one child has one father in terms of sperm, but several fathers in terms of biofield. The genetic apparatus of man, this is a very complex system. And for the sake of economy, as in many complex informational algorithmic systems, one and the same information is not always repeatedly recorded in it on different fragments of carriers. Quite often, information is recorded once, and in those places where it's necessary to access this information, there are simply links, analogs of links, as it is in programming. What does this mean practically? This means, if we draw an analogy, you are reading, say, a chemistry textbook, and in one chapter, you come across a phrase that this section will be thoroughly considered in chapter such and such. You wish to consider this theme now, and you turn directly to that chapter. There is a typographical flaw, and instead of, say, the 10th chapter of the chemistry textbook, which was referred to in the 5th chapter, you have the 10th chapter from a geography textbook. The question is blocked. You cannot master the information. So, promiscuous sexual relations lead to the fact that at the level of biofield genetics, there are mutually conflicting links to mutually incompatible information, or there are failed links, empty ones. That is, there is a link, but there is no informational algorithmic support for it. A child who has several fathers in terms of biofield and one father in terms of sperm faces a problem in the process of personal development to fill in the missing information or to overcome informational conflicts. In a mild form, the consequences of telegony are expressed in the fact that the child pesters his parents with the question, "Dad, are you my dad?" This question stems from the fact that somewhere he unconsciously feels that some information is accessible to his psyche, which is not in his dad's biofield, and not in the ancestral spirit of his dad. But if this information is present, then the question is natural. Where does this information, and one of the forms of the question, "Dad, are you my dad?" come from? In more severe cases, telegony is schizophrenia, and the mutual non-correspondence of different parts of the body to each other. This can be expressed as a very significant imbalance in the structure of the organism, as well as vices of development. If we talk about how the elite lived at all times, then the elite always made sure that its family was protected, if possible, from telegony and from interference in the ancestral line by the genetic material of those social groups that, from its point of view, did not belong to the elite. In a number of cases, in order to ensure superiority in some aspects, the elite even went to closely related marriages, risking the consequences of inbreeding in order to pass on certain ancestral characteristics to their descendants, since its representatives believed that they expressed its advantage over all others. That is, the relation towards the family is one of the key indicators in order to characterize any society. If we correlate with the hierarchy of priorities of generalized means of governance, then the destruction of the institution of the family in the society of the supposed victim of aggression takes place on all of them as a prerequisite for the implementation of real aggression. And, in fact, one way or another, it affects genetics. It is a well-known fact that when a mosquito hatches from a larva, it is a full-fledged representative of its species. If a person is born, then he takes place as a human only as a result of adequate upbringing and education. And childhood is given to us in order to prepare for an independent adult life. During childhood, there is not only the development by us of certain knowledge, the development of certain skills, but also the deployment of the structure of the organism. It turns out that the principle works. If little Ivan didn't learn, then big Ivan will never learn. This principle covers both the deployment of the structures of the organism itself and the formation of the personal psyche as an informational algorithmic system. Why? Because practice shows that if speech skills at a certain age are not sought after, then the proper development of the speech center in the left hemisphere does not occur. The literature describes such a case. One American, a single mother, left her child alone in front of the television. The television showed whatever it might be. The child began to draw advertising screensavers, but did not begin to speak when it was time. Hard work of psychologists was done in order that speech skills would manifest in the child. In other words, this is an example that shows that the psyche, physiology, and anatomy in the human organism are very, very closely connected. And the unwantedness for certain skills at a certain time results in either a complete underdevelopment of the corresponding structures of the organism, or their limited development, which subsequently either cannot be compensated at all, or cannot be adequately compensated. If you look at the life of any person, Then, in his life, there is a period over which his mother is practically undividedly powerful, and no one else. This period, this is the prehistory of conception until about 2.5 to 3 years old, when the child begins to confidently use articulate speech and, on the basis of articulate speech, enters into communication with those with whom he considers it necessary, and refuses to communicate with those who, for various reasons, are frightening or not interesting for him. What happens in this time interval, from the prehistory of conception to the entry of the child into the speech period? The main thing happens. First, the mother chooses the one who will become the father. The instinctively conditioned psychology is such that the decisive role, in fact the leading role, belongs to the woman. The responsive reaction of the man is really responsive, although the illusion that the initiative belongs to the man is a consequence of the fact that the same algorithmics implies the need to overcome a kind of resistance of the female before that. That is, the female arouses interest in herself among many. But, in order to continue the ancestral line and improve the genetics of the population, someone who is the strongest, again from the point of view of the female, must win. What else happens? During this period, the spiritual heritage of the future child is laid. That is, during this period, biofield connections are formed with certain egregors, with which the child will be connected from the moment of conception to birth and further in life. If sexual intercourse is promiscuous, then there will be many connections that will subsequently complicate the life of this child. In addition, if there is something wrong in one's own ancestral egregors, then this is the period when this wrong can be blocked. If conception does not occur under the power of instincts, but really in conditions of love, then the spiritual heritage is formed in the best way, and the combinatrix of everything, the shuffling of genes in the process of sperm and egg formation, develops in the best possible way. One such example that the process of conception is nraviously ethically conditioned. But for those who consider religion a fiction and limit ethics to the condition of society, the boundaries of society, consider ethics not objective but subjectively generated, this example does not mean anything for them. It is well known that the heir apparent, Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, the son of Nikolai II, suffered from hemophilia. Hemophilia, this is the incoagulability of the blood. That is, any scratch may be enough for a person to bleed out and die. Normal blood coagulates with oxygen and blocks the ducts through which the bleeding is possible. Hemophilia is connected with a gene present on the female X chromosome. If the second female X chromosome in the organism of the mother is healthy, then, by virtue of the fact that hemophilia is a recessive factor, it does not manifest itself in the mother. If the woman is unlucky and she got both chromosomes with the hemophilia gene, she has a chance to die just by any menstruation. When a boy is born, he inherits either a healthy gene or a diseased gene from his mother. The statistical predetermination of hemophilia in the heir to the crown prince was 0.5. And, with a different alignment of genes in the process of the formation of the mother's egg, a healthy boy, who would have become the heir to the throne, could have been born. What would the fate of Russia in the future have been? This is an open question. The Tsarevich was born at the turn of July-August 1904. At this time, the Russo-Japanese War was ongoing. If you rewind 9 months before, what was in history? The majority do not ponder on what was happening during the conception of the Crown Prince. During the period of conception, there were negotiations between Russia and Japan, in which Russia took the position, we need a small victorious war in order to prevent a revolution. Now, if we recognize the fact that God speaks to each and everyone in the language of life circumstances, then the birth of the Crown Prince with hemophilia is an appeal to Emperor Nikolai II. You already received the nickname Bloody when you ascended the throne because of the Khadinka tragedy. You say that you are the Tsar father of the people, so over every drop of the people's blood you should tremble, just as you will tremble over every drop of the blood of the heir. But the Orthodox tradition refers all this to superstition. Therefore, the message in this form did not reach him. Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War, into which it was drawn because of extreme stupidity. Because, in order to believe that there would be no war in 1904, one had to be extremely stupid. Because the shipbuilding programs of Japan ended in 1904, the very last ships had to go into operation. Russian shipbuilding programs ended in 1905. Accordingly, 1904 is the only year for Japan when it could either agree with Russia on the settlement of the conflict of interests in the Far East region of the country, or resolve this conflict in its favor with brute military force, without waiting for the completion of the Russian shipbuilding programs and the acquisition of a superior military technical power by the Russian Navy. To negotiate under such conditions, under the slogan, "We need a small, victorious war," in order to prevent the revolution, one had to have had very serious psychic and nravious damage. So, the reality is such that, indeed, A lot in the process of conception is conditioned by the nraviously conditioned purpose-orientedness of the parents towards this or that. And if the children are simply an accidental product of sex under the guidance of instincts, then children are for parents, first of all, a mirror in which they can see those problems that they do not want to solve themselves in their own destinies. The reality is precisely such. If we turn to Russian folktales, their difference from Western folktales is that in Western folktales there are beautiful princesses. Simple, ordinary ladies that the princes marry are also beauties. And in Russian folktales, the ideal of a woman is Vasilisa the Wise. Yes, she is beautiful, but at the same time, she is wise. And if we talk about the possibilities of bringing Russia out of the crisis, then these possibilities are connected with a long-term strategy. And in this strategy, the living generations must conceive and raise the generation of Vasilisas the Wise, who, in turn, will conceive, give birth to, and upbring those who will solve the residual problems inherited from the past and will not create new problems. Because it is wrong to think that creative potential and its realization is the lot of a man. The reality is such that the creative potential is equally characteristic of both men and women. But it is realized in different ways due to the biologically different functions of both sexes in the life of the biological species Homo sapiens. No one can replace a woman as a mother. Since, at the first stages of a child's life, no one can replace his mother, life is built in such a way that normally the creative potential of a man is realized in interaction with the problems that life gives society. Men solve them directly. And the creative potential of a woman, in the overwhelming majority of cases, is realized either through her life partner, in relation to whom, due to the fact that in today's culture women are usually intuitively superior to men, she indicates the paths of development, even if the man is not an underhealer. If he is an underhealer, then the woman manipulates him as she sees fit, or as the egregorial algorithmics are retranslated through her. In this aspect, it is again necessary to return to the family of the last emperor. During her lifetime and later, Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna was sometimes groundlessly accused of being German and an agent of German influence. And the reality is such that although she was German, she spent her childhood at the court of her beloved grandmother, Queen Victoria of England. Then she married the heir to the Russian throne. Alexander III was against this marriage and blessed this marriage only on his deathbed, and he had reasons, because apparently he understood that Nikolai would be an underhealer, and Princess Alice factually became an agent of pro-British influence on Russian policy, because everything that happened after the death of Alexander III in Russian politics, and above all, in external politics, was fully consistent with the interests of Britain. And when the February Revolution took place, information about this reached London. In the British Parliament, the phrase was pronounced, "One of the objectives of the war has been achieved." In what was the pro-British influence expressed? It was expressed in the Russo-Japanese War, and in the fact that Russia was drawn into the First World War. Historians, for the most part, do not notice such a fact. After the death of Alexander III, Russia's external politics changed. Under Alexander III, resources were collected that were supposed to be used in the construction of a naval base in the area of modern Murmansk, and in the deployment of the main forces of the Russian Imperial Fleet in the north of Kola Bay. The continuation of politics in this direction would have ensured the conditions for the peaceful existence of Russia until about the middle of the 20th century, because a scenario like the Crimean War would have been blocked by the fact that the British metropolis could live on its own support of various products that were significant for it, from 2 weeks to 3 months. And if we talk about such a military technical task as blocking the deployment of the forces of the Russian Navy and cruising squadrons from the Kola Bay area to the Atlantic, then this task did not have a guaranteed solution until the 60s, 70s of the 20th century. For example, in 1939, a few days before the German attack on Poland, the German liner Bremen left New York and disappeared in the Atlantic. The British tried to intercept it. They had aircraft carriers, they had seaplanes, they had radio communications, they already had radars. Nevertheless, the Bremen crossed the Atlantic, came to Murmansk, stayed there for 2 weeks, and, when the situation became more or less stable, it left Murmansk for Germany. But imagine, there is no aviation, no aircraft carriers, no radar, radio communication will be invented and will become widespread decades later. It is necessary to stop the deployment of the forces of the Russian Navy from the Kola Bay area in the polar night. How? Poorly solvable task. In some literature, there is mention of certain military exercises done by the USA in the 1970s or 80s. The objective of the exercise, the aircraft carrier Forrestal, and the escort ships must hide under the clouds from the air and space reconnaissance of the US in radio silence. For 2 weeks, the Americans were looking for their own aircraft carrier in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean and could not find it. And the exercise was terminated by issuing a command to finish the exercise. That is, the policy of Alexander III, aimed at creating a base in the Kola Bay and the main forces of the Russian Navy there, was strategically far-sighted, and it guaranteed the unwillingness to attack Russia by England and its potential satellites for decades ahead. That is, this policy and its continuation could have qualitatively changed the face of the modern world. Alexander III dies, and what happens? Murmansk was built urgently during the First World War. Alexander III planned to build a double-track railway there at once. In the 1980s, the Leningrad-Murmansk Railway was in some sections single-track. The money intended for the development of the Murmansk region was invested in the construction of the Libavsk naval base and partially in Port Arthur. Both bases proved their worthlessness for Russia, both in the First World War, Libava, and in the Second World War. Whose interests was this in line with? The interests of Great Britain. Who was the conductor of interests? Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, not intentionally, but under egregorial guidance. Why do I say under egregorial guidance? Because, apparently, she sincerely converted to orthodoxy, but retained a connection with the imperial egregor of Great Britain. During her life in Russia, she was characterized as a person with an extremely unstable psyche and was constantly falling into depression. And, while she was a teenage girl, she was called Sunny in Germany. But if Sunny fell into depression, then as a result of what? The husband loved her, it is true. But if her psyche became the battlefield of the British imperial egregor and the Russian imperial egregor, and she could not decide on which side she was participating in this battle, then it's understandable why there was always depression. Bad psychosomatics, depressed health, and a whole slew of problems in the family of the last emperor. That is, it really turns out that the institution of the family is a key institution for solving all problems. And one of the factors of its destruction is the corruption of the enemy's girls, so that the subsequent generations are biologically defective and cannot pose a serious threat in geopolitical confrontation. Look at what happened in the 1990s. What the mass media worked for: to deprave the younger generations, and, above all, to deprave girls. And now they are working for it. The question arises: where is the activeness of the FSB? Where is the activeness of the prosecutor's office, aimed at suppressing the corrupting of the younger generations by the mass media and partly by the school? In general, we are talking about the fact that if Russia is not a crypto colony, for which the corruption of the younger generations is the norm and an instrument of its enslavement, then freedom of speech, freedom of artistic creation, should be understood based on the meaning that Sovest is the basis of freedom. Freedom is given by God, guidance by Sovest. And accordingly, freedom of creativity, freedom of speech should not cause problems and catastrophes in the life of society. If the so-called freedom of speech and freedom of creativity cause problems and catastrophes, then, in a nraviously healthy and intellectually healthy society, the state, if it serves society, must ruthlessly and mercilessly suppress this kind of so-called freedom of speech and freedom of creativity. If we talk about the interconnections of the social institutions with each other, then, at short intervals of time, the state plays a decisive role. Because the state governs those affairs that people alone, and on the basis of episodic self-organization, factually cannot solve. If the state abuses power or makes mistakes, then the consequences of these mistakes, if considered at short intervals of time, cannot be compensated by anybody alone and on the principles of self-organization. In the Russian language there is a saying, "The people sin, the Tsar prays it away. The Tsar sins, no one will pray it away." That is, the factor of the performance speed, in this case, is decisive. Certain vices of society can be compensated for by adequate state governance. In the saying, this is reflected in the words, "The Tsar will pray it away." Vices of state governance at short intervals of time cannot be compensated for by any social self-organization. And at long intervals of time? At long intervals of time, they can be compensated for by what is called the role of the personality in history. And a personality is a product of the family. And, first of all, the mother plays a decisive role in the formation of the personality, because everything that happens in the interval from conception to the beginning of the child's communication with other people on his own initiative, this is practically in the undivided power of the mother. There, the foundation of nraviousness is laid, the foundation of ethics is laid, the foundations of the world-view and world-understanding are laid there. If the mother copes with these tasks to the maximum, then a personality can develop on this foundation. If there is no foundation, an attempt to form a personality on the basis of something loose and indefinite leads to the appearance of an appendage to a chair, a TV, a bottle of beer, something else, and there is no point in talking about a personality as such. Further, it turns out that families in society are statistically distributed according to different types. At one statistical pole, the family is of the individual with a suitcase type, which, in general, is not connected with anything. How he lives is an open question, because here there are also two polar variants, either an outrageous consumer or an ascetic, who has neither the time nor the energy to engage in any other things, except for those in which he is engaged. At the other pole of statistics, there is a family of many generations living as one household in a common house with many children, at least one branch of the family. The question arises, which is better? In fact, if from the point of view of consumption of freedom and absence of life obstacles, then the best is the family, a person individual with a suitcase and a large wallet. The so-called sexual companion relationship or sex trade relationship on both sides without any obligations to each other of a long-term character, and moreover, without any obligations in relation to the task of procreation. That is, such an approach is really an antisocial approach for the simple reason that later, when these loners become old and lose their ability to work, the question of their social security will arise. And the social security of such loners who spent their whole lives, and instead of engaging in this or that socially useful cause, earned money, this is not the same thing. It is a heavy economic burden on society, and, in fact, it will be better for society if they leave this world themselves as a result of depression or some kind of psychosomatic illness, without burdening society with the need to support their meaningless existence in old age. One example of this kind, yesterday's event, the death of V.I. Novodvorskaya. Life was given to her to learn to love. She lived as an empty talker and barren bloomer, neglecting this opportunity. And if we proceed from the fact that every person must take place as a human, precisely as a carrier of the human type of psyche structure, then the best environment for the formation of a personality is a family of several adult generations living in a common household, and ideally, this family lives in interaction with the natural environment. That is, the reality is such that if we are interested in the blago of society in the future, moreover, at the level of strategy, but not at the level of quality of life of those living today, and the maximum of their children, then the state should be oriented towards supporting the family of many generations, a nraviously healthy family living by its labor, because such a family gives informal lessons on how every child, people, should interact with each other, and it reveals to the child all the upcoming age periods and all the problems that are connected with the periods of different ages. That is, this is the best environment for the child to truly take place as a personality. In addition, there is yet another specificity related to medicine. So, if you look at history, then these so-called geniuses, for the most part, are not the first children in the family. With what is this connected? It is connected with two circumstances. The first, this is the possibility of birth trauma with the first birth. It is higher than in subsequent ones. And, accordingly, subsequent children are less burdened in mass statistics with the consequences of unsuccessful in some way childbirth. This is one side of the question. The second side of the question is that a whole slew of ancestral problems from egregors that have in one way or the other not been worked off by parents fall on the first child. Therefore, subsequent children inherit a less problematic ancestral spiritual heritage, especially in cases where parents do not stop in personal development, but continue to develop. And, seeing a mirror in the first children, they work towards eliminating those problems that exist in the family. Then, subsequent children get fewer problems, and their creative potential turns out to be more free in relation to solving problems in the life of society. Therefore, it turns out that if society is oriented towards the norm being a childless family, the norm being adoption, the norm being a small family, and a large family, this is a problem in the formulation why reproduce poverty, then society thereby greatly limits its potential of development in the future, because younger children, in conditions of the wrong culture, possess a higher potential of development in their average statistical mass. If the theme of adoption is touched upon, the theme of adopted children, then here there is also a problem. The problem is connected with the fact that in the majority of cases, children who need adoption were conceived and born in dysfunctional families. Therefore, the primary task of foster parents is to protect the foster child from his ancestral egregors, which are filled not with that information and algorithmics that are needed for the life of this child to become problem-free. And so it turns out that the foster family should really love, should not waste time on all the fuss, but should devote as much time as possible to the foster child, facilitating his independent solution of his problems and helping him in this. Why? Because if a child does not find informational algorithmic support for his development in the family that adopted him, then the informational vacuum is filled by that which is in his ancestral egregors. And if the foster family does not cope with the upbringing, then there begins, upon reaching adolescence, the automatic development of any algorithmics which is in his ancestral egregors, and has led to the fact that the child has become a social orphan with living parents. But this theme, unfortunately, does not receive proper coverage in pedagogical higher educational institutions and courses for foster parents. And, unfortunately, many parents solve the task of achieving, be it their own child or foster child, obedience from the child, instead of working towards ensuring that he enters into youth with a developed will, subordinate to Soviet. And these are different upbringing strategies inherent to them, different methods of achieving objectives, not to mention the fact that the objectives are different. If, nonetheless, some part of parents understands this problematics or simply feels it, and lives sensually and intuitively in line with its resolution, then society has a chance that their children will grow up, receive the due education, or be intellectually developed enough to, in addition to the system of education, develop the necessary knowledge and skills, and they will enter into state power and make the state capable of dealing with the tasks of social development. Because an attempt on the part of the state to pull by the ears what does not grow is simply a waste of time and effort. The same applies to the development of science and the system of education. In relation to all this, the key is the functioning of the institution of the family. And if we talk about what is happening in the family, then the main question is the relationship between a man and a woman, as spouses and as parents. If these problems in the family are resolved correctly, then the family is able to protect the child from the pernicious influence of the mass media, the internet, the street, and everything else. The child is then able to enter into adulthood, being capable in relation to the mission of solving tasks of social development and eliminating problems. If the family cannot solve these tasks, then the problems of society are inevitable, and society is doomed either to a protracted crisis or to a cultural catastrophe. The circumstance that we are talking about, this is an indicator that Russia is not prospectless. It is an indicator that we are overcoming the crisis, because in such a context, and in such interconnections in other cultures, they do not talk about the problematics of social development. Further on, we need to talk about the interaction of society as a set of social institutions and the organizational technological complex of the national economy, that is, about the building and functioning of the economy.